Hi, and welcome to this live reading from What Actually Happened to Isaac Moore by Samantha J. Rose, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue, the question on a few people's minds. Whatever happened to Isaac Moore? A young lady asked. She had fancied him with his charm, sophisticated look, and magically smooth brown hair. Oh, and the successful business he'd inherited. There was no overlooking that. A young man responded with pretend hesitance. Well, I'm not sure how to tell you this, but he was actually very happy to tell her since he fancied her. But he went out to sea and hasn't been heard of since. I reckon he and his crew got caught up in that big storm a few months back. Tragic, really. So very, very sorry. He moved in closer, putting a comforting arm around her shoulders. Yes, that was the word among anyone who cared enough to ask the question. They went on with their lives, assuming he, his crew, and his ship with her sails had drowned in the depths of the ocean. But this is what actually happened to Isaac Moore. Chapter 1, The Great Arnaud. Isaac was a dreamer. He had been ever since he could dream, because dreams were all he had. Well, that and the beat of his heart, but these things were all he really needed. His mother had told him so. Isaac held on to that truth long after she died. As he mopped the mud and filth-encrusted floors of the orphanage he grew up in, he would drift away in dreams of grandiose palaces on the tops of mountains that touched the stars, like in the storybook his mother used to read to him. He'd think about those times when he and his mother would look at the brilliant night sky and talk about those palaces, what they might look like, what kind of food they'd have, and what it might be like to live so close to the sky that they could catch the moon. They did that a lot before she died. When he was older, Isaac realized that there was another thing he needed in life in order to survive, something that his mother had not really mentioned, but of its necessity the orphanage had taught him well. Money. One cannot eat or sit in warmth, let alone build a palace in the mountains, without money. Isaac began working at a young age with a merchant crew. He sailed the seas and traded goods between countries. It didn't take long before the captain, Benjamin Snow, took notice of Isaac's strong ambition and discipline, how he worked harder than anybody else. See, in Isaac's mind, in order to be true to one's own beating heart, one had to be willing to work hard and obey the rules. This was another wise thing his mother had taught him. Sometimes you have to work hard and obey rules before you find freedom, she had said. You have to be disciplined, always making sure you're doing your very best. Then, when the time is right, you break free. This wisdom proved very beneficial. He quickly rose through the ranks from the forecastle to third, second, and finally first officer, making quite a name for himself, a name which he'd back up with the many lies he'd tell about where he came from, such as his father being a wealthy duke from the north of England who owned a large estate in France. He spoke properly, as his mother had inspired him to do, and told these stories with such ease and arrogance that people couldn't help but believe him. He almost convinced himself. For all he knew of his father, it could have been true. When people asked, why then are you part of a merchant crew? He would come back with, for the adventure. Oh, it's so boring living in a mansion, having servants wait on you hand and foot. You haven't the faintest idea. It's just awful. Simply had to get away from it, make my own way and my own fortune. Captain Snow was perfectly aware of Isaac's unfortunate origins, but when asked, he'd confirm Isaac's stories. It's the truth, he'd say. Having no children of his own, he saw Isaac as a son. He wanted to be the sort of father that his child could rely on, one that would protect him and even uphold his harmless nonsense. And as many loving fathers often do, he never judged Isaac too harshly. The years passed. The captain became ill and died, leaving his ships and his business to Isaac. As the old sea captain had loved the boy as his only child, Isaac had loved him as any child would love their benevolent father. It wasn't easy for Isaac to accept how every important person in his life had found an exit out of it, leaving him alone with nothing but his beating heart and his dreams. He had a profitable business. He had freedom. He'd sailed the world from the coasts of Sydney to Maine, but he was empty. What value was any of this without the people who had given life warmth and light? All he really had was a dark, festering void inside his chest that nothing could fill, that refused to heal. It was a pain that would choke him sometimes, completely stealing his breath and his mind. It usually happened with an unexpected reminder, like seeing a mother embrace a small boy with a loving smile, or meeting a woman named Christine, the name of Captain Snow's favorite ship and of the girl from his stories. He'd freeze, blinking back tears and pushing away scars. He heard nothing and saw no one, not until someone brought him back to the present. The most important people in his life were gone. Earning money was a rush, however. He'd throw it at the void and silence its cries for a time. He reasoned that maybe if he had more money, he'd feel better, less empty. And there was Arnaud. Among the crew Isaac had grown up with, there was an old man whose hair, beard, and long mustache ranged from white to a little less white, and was missing patches in random places. He was also missing one of his eyes. This was Arnaud. Arnaud had been in the background of Isaac's life since he'd joined the merchant crew, telling strange stories that raised eyebrows. His presence made everyone a little uneasy, no matter how nice he tried to be, and he did try. He'd been there for Isaac through the loss of Captain Snow. He never judged the tears he shed in the quiet of his cabin, and always looked upon him with a genuine understanding and sympathy, never saying a hollow or patronizing word. On top of this, he was an expert at negotiation and spotting crooks. So whenever any of Isaac's crew spoke ill of the old man, whether Arnaud was present or not, Isaac went out of his way to defend him. No one was allowed to mock the weird gurgle in his voice or speak about his bad smell. Yes, Arnaud needed to take better care of himself, but he deserved respect. Anything less wasn't tolerated on Isaac's ship. Business went well enough for a while. He started to make plenty of money and was able to purchase another ship. But it didn't last. What really marked the beginning of the end for Isaac was the loss of his ships through a series of misfortunes, one to pirates and another to a storm. He was forced to sell another to pay off debt. It all happened so fast. He'd managed to fool some into thinking he still had money to his name. But the reality was that Isaac was about to lose his business. He was down to his last ship. He'd be penniless, homeless, and a despised and nameless beggar left to die on a cold winter night. The thought frightened him, chilling the marrow in his bones every time it crossed his mind. He could almost see the snow falling from the dark sky. He'd die and be forgotten, left to the dogs. They returned home from a business venture early one morning, Isaac slightly drunk and discussing his hopeless plight with the one person on the ship he trusted not to tell the world, Arnaud. He even told Arnaud about the book his mother used to read to him. In this book, he said with his handsome yet sad smile, there was this prince. I believe his name was it Sky? Something. Anyway, his sister was kidnapped and taken to this enchanted river. Each of the river's branches led to a completely different world. Worlds that were colorful and others where gold was as plentiful as sand. And there was one that was all fire and rock, so of course you had to be careful of which route you chose. He went to all these different worlds in search of her. He sighed, his eyes glittering with nostalgia. I used to dream of traveling up that river, of finding a world that was better than this one. I'd build a castle there on a mountaintop that touched the stars, just like he did. Isaac looked at the rising sun, lost in his memories. Arnaud smiled. He glanced around the deck as if to make sure they were alone. What if I told you, Arnaud said, his voice sounding like gurgling sewage trying to find an outlet to the ocean, that the river is real? Isaac laughed. Then I would trade you my ship for directions to it. After a thoughtful moment, he added, and for a lift, of course, I'd probably need a lift since I'd no longer have a ship. He returned his attention to the dawn, taking a drink. Out of his dirty inner coat pocket, Arnaud pulled a battered old book and placed it against the railing in front of Isaac. Isaac's brown eyes grew wide. He asked with reverence, "Where did you get that?" It was the book from his childhood. He hadn't seen it since his first month in the orphanage. He had returned to his room one day to discover with tremendous heartbreak that it was gone. He'd assumed it had been taken by John I or John II since they'd given him grief over the title, telling him it was a book for girls. What did they know? They hadn't read it. He told them they were primitive apes, doomed to live sad lives just as his mother would have. Then they beat him up. "It's mine, yeah," said Arnaud with a gargle. "Doesn't matter how I got it." Arnaud handed it to Isaac, and he took it carefully as if it was the most sacred object in existence. It seemed so much bigger when he was little, but it was small enough to fit comfortably in the palms of his hands. He ran his fingertips over the letters of the faded title. Princess Song in the River. "You keep it, Captain," Arnaud told him. Isaac's eyes couldn't contain his surprise and gratitude. "I couldn't possibly," he began, only to be polite. "Stop it," growled the old man with a small wave of his hand. Isaac opened the book and looked over the old pictures. His head spun with a flood of memories, emotions, and wine, but he managed to hold himself together. He would not allow himself to fall apart there on the deck. Maybe when he was back in his quarters alone, he'd let himself sob like a woman gifted her dream wedding gown, but not there. Although when he managed to finally say, "Thank you, Arnaud," some of the emotion slipped out in spite of himself. He cleared his throat and pretended it didn't happen. He turned to a drawing of the river. It mapped out the tributaries leading off to other worlds. Arnaud placed a finger on the picture and said, "The river is real." Isaac raised his eyebrows and studied Arnaud, looking for any sign that he had a secret side to his sense of humor that he'd never noticed before. He'd thought it possible earlier. Seeing that he was serious, Isaac decided that he would play along. He returned his attention to the book and asked nicely, "Is that so, Arnaud? So, where is it? South America?" He perked up and said with a sly smile, "Perhaps that's how you actually get to that city of gold you hear about, eh? Like maybe it's not a city of gold, but an entire planet of gold?" Arnaud reached into another pocket of his coat and then held out his hand. Isaac had never seen anything like these gems before in all his life. They looked like pieces of the sun contained in perfect diamonds, but their surface was round and smooth like pearls. They looked as though they would be burning right through Arnaud's palm. Where had they gotten them? Arnaud had always appeared to be the opposite of a wealthy man. He wore the same outfit every single day and seemed to spend each dollar he received before it ever reached his hand. Isaac never would have imagined him as someone who had a secret hoard of treasure. Before Isaac could ask, Arnaud stated, "These came from the river," pointed to a world toward the upper middle but slightly left of the map. And when he spoke, his voice cracked with sorrow. "From this world. So you're saying you've been there before?" Arnaud looked longingly at the page, seeming to hold back tears as he nodded. "It has been my greatest dream to return, and a few years ago I found the way back." Was Isaac really supposed to believe that? Arnaud had disappeared for 2 or so years after Captain Snow died, but he'd said it was for family reasons. Isaac studied him. He looked completely serious, but it was impossible, wasn't it? But then there were these gems, those absolutely magnificent gems. But it was impossible. But those gems, they couldn't be genuine because it was ridiculous. They sure appeared to be genuine. They certainly weren't glass. They held a brilliant sheen that made them glow ever so subtly. But they couldn't be real because it was all nonsense. He couldn't even believe they were having this conversation. Everything about this was impossible. Wasn't it? Isaac closed the book and tucked it protectively under his arm. "You really expect me to believe this?" Arnaud raised his patchy eyebrows. "I really thought the gemstones would convince you, but perhaps you're not looking at them closely enough." He held them out a little farther, and Isaac, looking skeptically at Arnaud, took a step closer. He studied the gems a little more carefully. Under the smooth, diamond-like surface, a bright orange color seemed to swirl like clouds and change in intensity. They were indeed genuine. An array of possibilities flooded his mind like a vivid dream. The gemstones, arranged as pearls strung around the slender necks of the world's most beautiful woman, in an item sure to be so popular that he would become one of the wealthiest men in the world. He'd be able to travel upriver to a world far better than this one. He would live in a mansion at the top of the mountains, garbed in fine clothes, smoking a pipe, surrounded by gold, with a gorgeous wife. She'd be safe there. They'd both be safe there. He'd never be destitute or alone again. All he needed was those gems and to find the river. He just needed to reach out, and Arnaud closed his hand and returned the gemstones to his pocket. Anger burned through Isaac, and his chest constricted as though he were drowning. He had to stop himself from throwing the man overboard. It was as if his inner self had taken a step in between the two of them before Isaac could lay a hand on Arnaud, yelling, "What are you doing, man? Get a hold of yourself!" Isaac put his outstretched hand to his spinning head like he'd been shaken awake from a deep sleep. But Arnaud looked happy. What do you think about it now? Think? Could he still think? He thought about that for a moment and realized that he could, apparently. Then he considered what he'd just seen. Everything he'd ever wanted. It felt so real and so close. He just needed to find that river, that world. Where is this river? You're holding the map to it, Arnaud said. Curious, Isaac took the book and opened it. Arnaud guided him to the very end, to the picture that covered the back of the last page and the inside of the back cover. It was a crude, elaborate drawing of the unknown world. A great emphasis, mapped out over southern Asia above the Indian Ocean, was the tributary leading out of the planet Earth and to the river. He studied it. Though he had never been to that particular coast of Asia, he knew it had been sailed to plenty of times, and no one had ever mentioned having accidentally ventured off to a completely different planet before. Of course, perhaps that was because no one had ever returned. No one, except Arnaud. I have a proposition for you, Arnaud said, with the gurgle that he would never, ever clear away. A proposition that will save your business and will make you richer than you can imagine. Something I would like to propose to you and the crew. All right, let's hear it, Isaac said, trying not to sound too eager. I have been saving money, waiting most of my life for this opportunity. I will fund the entire expedition to this river, and you can have all the treasure found if you will take me with you and name the ship after me. Name it Arnaud. He nodded. Isaac raised an eyebrow. I fail to see how that benefits you at all. You don't have to see it. Those are my terms. This ship had been Captain Snow's most beloved, Christine. Isaac was not about to name it after Arnaud. What kind of name was that anyway? Arnaud. Granted, he had a great deal of respect for the man, but in comparison to Captain Snow, well, there was no comparison. To change the ship's name from the one he'd chosen to Arnaud would be cursing it to smell like armpits and bad breath for all eternity. It would make a gurgling noise everywhere it went. No, this would not do. It didn't matter that he had passed away to unseen shores. This was Captain Benjamin Snow's ship. It was the last possession of his that Isaac could touch. His presence accompanied Isaac when he stood on the bow and breathed in the salty sea air. If he changed its name, would it still be Captain Snow's ship? Would his presence vanish for good? Isaac's heart, his very soul, fled from the thought. No. This was Isaac's business and about to be his expedition, and this was Captain Snow's ship. He was certain that they could come up with something better as far as terms went. Maybe Isaac could name his next ship Arnaud. Heavens, that could be the name of the next 2 or 3. However many Arnaud wanted. But not this ship. But then again, treasure from another world was a sure way to save Captain Snow's business, his legacy. Perhaps if changing the name of the ship was essential to the cause. No, he didn't like it. Considering it made his skin crawl, he couldn't be that important to Arnaud. There had to be something better they could both agree to. Isaac asked, why now, Arnaud? If you've known about this for so long, why be sitting on it all this time? Arnaud looked at the sky. I wasn't ready. Now I am. The time is right. That really didn't answer anything. In fact, it added questions. The voice of reason crept its way into Isaac's mind, telling him he wasn't making intelligent decisions, and something was clearly wrong, but those vivid visions of wealth and cured loneliness quickly silenced it. His hopeless prayers had been answered. Did it really matter if Arnaud's motives made any sense? Isaac shrugged. All right then, that's good enough for me. Wake the crew. We have important matters to discuss.